Stanley Rosenberg was brought up as a foster child in the area and went to public schools all the way through his education, including the University of Massachusetts, which at that time in the 1970s was not common for a future legislator to go to UMass Amherst. He graduated in 1977 with a degree in arts management, and while at UMass, he played the tuba in the marching band. I'm an alum of UMass, and I get the alumni information, and always it is the graduates of the marching band who are the most dedicated alums to UMass Amherst. And Stanley Rosenberg has not only been dedicated to UMass Amherst, but to public education in the Commonwealth, from K through 12, community colleges, the state university system. He has probably been the strongest advocate for public education in the last 30 years. And so all of us who care about education, care about our children and the future of education in Massachusetts, have much to thank him for. After he graduated in '77, he was the founder and first director of the Arts Extension program at UMass, then went into community development and human services, interests that will continue to be a focus of his work from then on. In 1980 to 83, he became an aide to then Senator John Olver. I'm sure many of you remember John Olver and his service to the state. He also served as executive director of the Massachusetts Democratic Party from 83 to 85, and as district director to Congressman Chester Atkins, another familiar name, from 85 to 86. In 1986, he was elected to the State House, representing District 3, which is Amherst and Pelham. He served in the State House as a representative until 1991, when there was a special election held to fill the vacant seat of John Olver. He won that election and has been in the state Senate since 1991. While in the Senate, he served as chair of the Election Laws Committee, chair of the Banking Committee, chair of the all-important Ways and Means Committee, assistant majority leader, and was the Senate's first president pro tempore from 2003 to 2013. He was appointed as the Senate majority leader in January 2013, and then 2 years later, in January 2015, he was elected unanimously as president of the Massachusetts Senate, and that's the position he holds today, and we hope he will hold it for a long time to come. During the 187th General Court, he served as the Senate chair of a special joint committee on redistricting, certainly a hot topic nationally, following the census of 2000 and 2010. Senator Rosenberg was also a key architect in the battle for same-sex marriage in Massachusetts and has been a leader in the struggle for LGBTQ rights throughout the state and nationally. Senator Rosenberg is also founder and co-chair of the Massachusetts Legislature's Foster Kid Caucus, the first of its kind in the nation, and a model for how state legislators might support the often difficult lives of foster children and also adoptive children. Senator Rosenberg has also been heavily involved in Pskov, Russia, where he and other members of the legislature and professional community have been traveling for over 15 years in an effort to foster goodwill and encourage economic, social, and political progress. He is also an active member of both the Council of State Government and Americans for the Arts, and his support for the arts also runs deep and wide. On his website, there's a quotation from Senator Rosenberg. Quote, "The best way to win someone's trust is to tell the truth, clearly, forcefully, directly, and I would add consistently. At this very anxious time in our nation, when we have a deep and, I would say, deserved mistrust for many who we've elected or who have been appointed, it is a particular honor to introduce a trustworthy man, Senator Stanley Rosenberg.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to this visit very much, but I did not know I was coming to hear my eulogy. But that was a very, very generous and pretty exhaustive description of how I've spent the last, many decades, let's say. And I think I want to start where you kind of left off, which is sort of what motivates me as a member of the legislature and as someone who has had the privilege of being in public service, because even for my whole career, because even when I was at the University of Massachusetts, going to school part-time and working full-time in order to make my way through college, because at that time our foster care system did not do as they do now, which is actually provide free tuition and fees. Free college education in one of our public colleges or universities, including all tuitions and tuition and fees. That's what we do now to help these young people. But at that time, we had to make our own way, and at 18, you left the system, you were independent, and you can imagine how much of a struggle it is when you think about the 18-year-olds who've been in your life, putting them out in the world on their own. And so it was quite a challenge. But almost immediately I found opportunities to engage on the campus in things that I look back on and think of as public service. And it laid the foundation for me moving forward. And it's always easier to look back and sort of put the pieces together and say, oh, that's what was going on, and maybe that's why I did what I did or how I did that. And so I remember that one of my two mentors who, after I dropped out of school for the second time, who convinced me to come back to school and gave me a part-time work-study job in his department, and then someone else did in another department so that I could piece it together. And I remember being in a discussion with him after he saw me on a cable TV show describing part of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And he called me that night and he said, I saw you on the cable show, and he said, I thought you did a very good job. You were so Stan. And I didn't quite understand that at that time, but I understand it a little better now, because that conversation was about public service and about engagement with the community and with government. And because I had actually had another conversation with him a few years later, and we kind of went back and forth, and he gave me his recollections of what I was saying, and he said it was just so interesting to hear someone of your age, because I was still pretty young at that point, articulating so clearly a set of motivations and ideas about our self-governing system, and not in sort of pablum and sort of tired political rhetoric, but the way someone who was seeing it and thinking about it as a young person. And he said it was so powerful and so convincing. It was just so clear that you believe in people influencing the decisions that affect their lives. And you believe in the system of government that we have that provides the opportunity for people to elect and then hold accountable periodically through frequent elections the people who they elect to be their voice. And over the years, I've reflected on so many of the things that I was doing back then and some of the opportunities that later came and how they were rooted in what I was doing back then. And I'm going to give you a very significant example of that in just a minute. But just the whole idea that This government does not belong to those of us who hold these offices. We are stewards of the offices. We hold the seat for a period of time. And we get the seat only because the individual people in the district, the community from which you are elected, basically are taking a piece of the power that they are granted by virtue of their being here in this place, and they're transferring it to you, and then you take that power and you're their voice 100 miles away in Boston or 1,500 miles away in Washington. And that you just have such a fundamental responsibility to remember that you're first elected as a delegate, as the academics would put it. You're there, you were delegated by your fellow citizens in your region to be their voice. But you must also be prepared to accept the responsibility of trusteeship, which the academics would tell us are those moments when, as an elected official, you're supposed to provide leadership that's reflective of the bigger picture, not just the interests of your constituents. Because sometimes there are issues that haven't yet fully developed enough at the local level in terms of a broad understanding of the complexities of the particular issue, but it requires action, and you can't wait any longer. You have to act, which means you have to lead, which means you have to make the decision and then go home and explain it. And then hope people understand the decision you made, and then hope that that decision plays out the way you envisioned it over time. And so I have a very fundamental belief in this system. And I've been lucky to be able to be in so many different positions to be able to try to actualize that. But this position that I'm in now is so unique. I'm the 93rd person in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the oldest continuously operating legislative body in the world. I'm the 93rd person who's had the opportunity to serve in this particular job and to lead this 40-member Senate. And I tried about 12 years ago, and I came in second. And second, you don't even get a cigar or a gold star. Fortunately, I was not exiled. I was given the title of President Pro Tem, which interestingly was an idea that I discussed with the gentleman who actually won the seat. And I sat down with him one day when we were both candidates, and I said, Trav, Senator Travellini, his nickname was Trav. I said, Trav, it's either going to be you or me, right? And he said, yep. And I said, there are 7 candidates. We've not had that in recent memory. Whichever of us wins this, we got to put together a governing coalition, and we've not had to do that in the past. And this Senate has one of the smallest leadership groups of legislatures all over the country. And I said, so I think what we should do is we should create a few more leadership spots and distribute more of the power to the other members. And he listened, and he listened. And I said, for example, virtually, I think it was at that time, 33 states had either a vice president of the Senate or a president pro tempore. And we did not have that position. I said, we should have a president pro tempore. And I said, and the reason we should have that is because the person who is currently the majority leader, neither of us is going to appoint that person majority leader because she's also a candidate. And he said, you're right. And I said, and we should respect the fact that she's a senior member, and therefore she should get a position of prominence and respect. And that would be President pro tempore. Well, after he got the votes, she challenged whether he actually had the votes. Naughty, naughty, naughty. So she sealed her fate when that was reported in the newspaper that she was making phone calls saying, I don't believe he has the vote. And so when it came time to fill that slot that I had recommended go to that person, guess who got the job? So that conversation, that act, was a small example of just planting a little seed about power sharing and about what I call shared leadership. And that's the model I'm using in the Senate, because for the last 30 years or so, power in the Massachusetts legislature has increasingly been centralized in the hands of the Speaker and the Senate President, more so than virtually, if not, than any other state in the country. And the academics would give you a list of powers and tools that a legislative body leader has in order to control the body, and every one of those in the Massachusetts system was in the hands of the Speaker for the House and the Senate President for the Senate, which meant that a lot of power is being concentrated in the hands of these two people, which meant that if you didn't behave, you could find yourself, because that person had so much power, being unable to do your job effectively. And people grew pretty tired of that, because not only was everything being controlled from how many pencils you could have to what office you were going to sit in to what committees you were going to sit on, everything was being controlled by the center. And then about 20 years ago, the Speaker of the House, who was the former Ways and Means Chair, he got elected to go up to Speaker. The former the former Senate Ways and Means Chair got elected to go up to the Senate President's office, and they both brought their senior policy staff from the Ways and Means Committee to the President's office, thereby centralizing now the policy development power, not just the operational power. And the members started getting very, very unhappy about this. So I started quietly talking with people and saying there are other ways of doing it, and I had done some reading and research, and I shared how this could be done. Well, it wasn't until about a year ago that I was reminded where all of that actually came from, because when I got elected, I said we were going to have a system of shared leadership. I was going to distribute the power back to the committee chairman to do their job. And I am going to re-empower them to help set the agenda and to help develop the legislation, and to basically let them be the leaders they were elected to be. So I was at an event, and I mentioned one of the mentors at UMass. Now the other mentor came to this event, saw me at the event, and he said, I have an envelope for you, and I knew you were going to be here, and I want to pass this envelope over to you. He said, I have been cleaning out my papers. He's since retired from the university, and he was cleaning out and organizing his papers. And he said, I found some documents that I think you ought to have. I thanked him, and I went home and I put it on the desk, and it took me quite a while to find the time to actually open the envelope. And before I tell you exactly what was in the envelope, I'll tell you that when I was in the marching band, as was pointed out, and by the way, I was actually a music major for one semester until they discovered I had no musical talent. And it's true what they say, tuba players cannot read music, because if a tuba player could read music, he'd play the trombone. And I went off to do other things, but while I was in the marching band, I did carry the tuba. And occasionally I could get a few notes out of it, but I could not march and play at the same time. I was a little bit of a guy, and that 40 pounds of metal on my back, 7 hours on a Saturday was just, so but at least I was in the band and I carried that tuba. But I decided to run for band manager one day, and my roommate was actually the incumbent band manager. That's how stupid I was. And, and so I got up to give my little speech, and Mr. Jenkins was sitting in the back of the room, who was the band director at the time, and the professor to which I have been referring, who gave me the envelope. And he was sitting in the back of the room, and he went just absolutely like stunned. And I could see in his face, I hope this kid doesn't win. Because I said, I think we need to develop a committee system. And we need to share the responsibility and share the leadership in this band. And I tell you, he went like white like a ghost. But Cliff won, and we stayed roommates, we stayed friends, never a bad word between us. And, but that was something I'd long forgotten. But when I opened that envelope, in the envelope were several documents, one of which was a paper that he and I had written together. And it was to the National, MENC, the National Music Educators Conference. Help me?
Music Educators National Conference.
There it is. He and I wrote this paper together about the benefits of teaching young people who are participating in band about the idea of, quote, shared leadership. And this was the man who went maybe 10, 12 years later, he and I wrote that paper together and presented it at a national meeting. And I completely forgot about the paper. And I completely forgot about the phrase. I had been describing but not using the words, shared leadership. And then, of course, in this day and age, you have to brand everything, right? Everything needs a brand. And so I was sitting with my team. I had lined up the votes. I was going to be the next Senate president. I was discussing some of the themes and the ideas. And I described how I wanted to run the Senate. And as we were going through and discussing, all of a sudden that phrase popped into my head, shared leadership. And I said, so like shared leadership? And they said, that's brilliant. So we are now building in the state Senate a model of operation which we call shared leadership, which also has, by the way, shared responsibility. So I think that was the first thing that I wanted to sort of talk about with you, is the transition that we're going through in the Senate. And now I want to extend that a little bit further because what mechanisms are you going to use to actually try to make that happen and make it work? And then how does it actually play out? And so we had the first ever retreat after the election and before I was elected Senate President, and all the senators came together, and we started to discuss what we had heard on the campaign trail, and started to brainstorm issues that the Senate should be working on in the next term. And we had a professional facilitator help us do this, and so she got everybody participating, and it was a very, very robust discussion. And then one of the senators said, you know, one of the best things we do is occasionally we go out and hold a public hearing on an issue or some legislation that we're working on, but outside of the State House. And we travel around the state and do that to give people a chance to express themselves to us. And he said, but we shouldn't do it just when we have a particular issue or a bill. We should just go out as a Senate and listen to the people. Brilliant idea. We launched that in February of my first year as Senate President. We called it Commonwealth Conversations, and we traveled the state, and it was amazing. We started actually in Western Mass. The first one was in Western Massachusetts. Starting in Berkshire County, went to Hampden County, and then over to Hampshire County. When we did it again this term, we came to Franklin County, and so we're mixing it up all over the state. And it was a really remarkable experience because from morning until night, the senators in a particular region would put together a set of activities so we could learn about some of the unique aspects of that particular region. We could hear the problems, the visions, the aspirations of people in that region, which we found were so similar in many cases all across the state, except they had the nuances that were from the local culture and locally what was going on. And in spite of being a very small state where you can pretty much drive anywhere in 3 hours from border to border, we had the opportunity to see how diverse the Commonwealth was, where the commonalities were and where the differences were. But the most remarkable part of the Commonwealth Conversations Tour was that every evening, those 8 days, we ended with a public forum at which 150 to 300 people would show up in a room very much like this, and we had between a third and more than half of the Senate sitting up front behind a table. And the most remarkable thing was we told them that we were not going to make any speeches, we were not going to be asking them questions, we were not going to be grandstanding, we were just going to listen. And of course, people didn't really believe that. But by a quarter of the way through, you could see they were starting to realize, well, we were serious. And by a third of the way through, the whole place was now focusing totally on the people who were standing up there speaking and not on the politicians. And it was a really remarkable experience as they heard each other talk about what was on their minds, their business, their family, their life, their school, their institution, their organization, whatever. It was totally amazing. They just had 2 minutes and everybody kept to the 2 minutes, and they said something of significance, something that meant a lot to them. We heard from between 60 and 100, 120 people at a few of them, 120, but between 60 and 100 virtually each of those nights. So we heard from a wide cross-section of the public, and it was pretty amazing. And then we went home, we took all that information, and we cataloged it, and then we convened the Senate. We said, okay, we heard the people. These were the major themes. This is what we said in our own retreat. So let's find the legislation in our committees that reflects what the people are asking us to do. And then they got to go back to their committees, their own bills, their committee's bills may not have been their bill, but it was in their committee, and we cataloged about 400 pieces of legislation that if we could pass a significant number of those, we would be making significant progress in addressing what people were asking for. Now, the interesting thing for me is if you go to the end of the 2-year term, I'm now describing last term, if you go to the end of that term and you look at the report that we put together at the end of the term of what the Senate debated and passed and sent to the House, and you looked at the report that we created at the end of the Commonwealth Conversations Tour, you could draw the lines. You could see what the connections were. The thing that's even more interesting is the Senate got 32 positive Boston Globe editorials on legislation that we passed, most of it after we passed the legislation. So we weren't chasing the editorials and saying, the Globe likes this, let's pass this bill. No, we had passed the bill, and then the legislation was praised by the editorial. So you go from listening to the people, to preparing the list, to finding the bills, to passing the bills, to getting validation that you heard the people and you responded. And it literally took almost 3 years now because the media is just finally figuring out what the Senate's actually doing. You talk about cynical. The media is extremely cynical about people in elective office. And if you think the public's cynical, the media is even more cynical. And I think that's partly because they see so much of it from the inside because they're right there and they know how to follow the dots. They know how to connect the dots and follow the bouncing ball so that they can see, you know, the games that are being played and the duplicitousness and all of that sort of stuff. So we extended this beyond that in another way. Remember I said earlier that the speakers and Senate presidents had reached the point that they were controlling the whole agenda and they were writing all the legislation. Well, I described how we dispersed the power to go find the legislation and write good legislation, and then we would work to pass that legislation. Well, now the question is, how do you choose from among the, because we have the right of free petition in Massachusetts, very few states have this, so any resident of the Commonwealth can ask that legislation be filed. So we get somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 bills every term, and that you cannot process 5,000 to 8,000 bills. You cannot possibly debate that many bills. So you have to make priorities, and then you have to make choices even within the priorities about what you're going to advance. So how do we do that? Well, historically, in the last at least 20 years or so, the Senate President and the Speaker, and whoever they chose to consult with, might have been their spouse, or might have been their staff, or might have been a few members, but they had the choice of who they were going to consult with. Well, we decided to pull together a different system, and we basically created a policy council, and we put 7 members of the Senate on the policy council. And they meet every 2 weeks, and they monitor the bills that are coming out of committee into the Senate, and then they make the recommendations to the caucus about what bills should be moved forward. And that is a diverse group of people because it includes several chairs and several members of leadership. And where under the old system, you came in at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning, and that's when you got the list of bills that were going to be debated starting at 1. So with the Policy Council, we have changed the system so that the Policy Council will give you anywhere from 1 week to as much as 8 weeks' notice that this bill has come into the Senate and we are preparing it for possible debate within the next X weeks. And then we keep the members updated. And then when a bill is ready to actually be debated, it ends up having 2 caucuses and an amendment deadline that gives both the members and the public the opportunity to read the bill, propose changes in the bill, and for people to have time to actually read the proposed changes in the bill, meaning the amendments. So where you used to have 2 hours, you now have typically 8 days, including 2 caucuses and the day of debate, in order to prepare yourself to debate the bill, and in order for your constituents to know you're about to do this. So this system is working very, very well. It has bumps in the road, and part of it is that the House of Representatives operates on a more centralized model, and so it presents some challenges. Not that the House isn't making some changes of its own as they go along. And so, for example, because we have a caucus every week now on a Wednesday, and we meet in formal session to debate on Thursday, the House, which used to have maybe, let's say, 1 caucus every 2 to 3, maybe 4 months, they're now caucusing at least once or twice a month. So changes are coming along to try to add transparency and provide opportunity for more engagement with the public. And what I believe happens as a result of that is that you are actually opening up the process. You're going to get a better result, and I hope people will have more confidence in the government and will see that their representatives are in fact representing them, and that these major decisions aren't being done in the dead of night, out of sight, without adequate opportunity for people to participate.
You make the changes sound so easy to bring about. How robust are they? Are they going to survive when you retire?
Say that again?
The changes you've made in the
Ah, very good point. It's very slow and hard to change culture of any organization. There's a couple of things to think about. The typical legislator in America serves 8 to 12 years, which means an average of 10 years. A Senate president can serve for no more than 8 years. I'm in year 3, which means that by the time I leave, if I stay the full 8 years, a very substantial portion of the body will never have known anything different. And they will want to continue it. The second thing we can do is to put some of these things in the rules. And because you vote on the rules every 2 years, but you don't change a lot of the rules each time. So if we put some of these processes in the rules, then they're likely to stay, and they'll think this is just the way it always was, and it ever should thus be.
Thank you.
So,
You have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature. Can you describe the positive working relationship you have?
yes. So we are a divided government in that we have a Republican governor, and of course the governor has more power than either the House or the Senate, but the House and the Senate together have more power than the governor if we unite. But the way things are operating, and they've operated this way for about 25 years now, because more often than not we've had Republican governors during that period of time and an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature. So we've had divided government for really most of the last generation plus. And when Governor Baker was elected, the Speaker and I decided that we were going to continue the tradition of the Monday afternoon meetings, and the governor was very much in favor of that, because they actually started when he was Secretary of Administration and Finance under then Governor Weld. Because it was Governor Weld, the Republican, who worked with Mr. Bulger and Mr. Flaherty at the time when they started these Monday meetings as a way of keeping lines of communication open, especially at that time because it was the first really deep recession since the Great Depression, and we were in the bucket, and they knew that if they didn't work together, we were going to have problems. So we institutionally, we meet virtually every Monday, and we have the governor, the speaker, the Senate president, the lieutenant governor, the two Ways and Means chairs, and the Secretary of Administration and Finance. So we can talk about the state finances and policy, and we can tell each other what we're thinking and working on, and we can ask each other questions, and we can try to noodle through setting up some of the processes we need to address various problems. And it's been very, very successful. So, for example, when they proposed the Olympics in Massachusetts, which a lot of people thought was a really cockamamie idea, you know, we met and we discussed it, and I told them, I said, you know, the last time I saw a situation like this, I was chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and we realized we did not have the depth of knowledge and skill in the government to be able to evaluate that decision. And therefore, we went out and we got a major consultant that had expertise in that area, and we actually made the people who asked us to make this decision pay for it, but it was going to be our consultant. And it worked beautifully, and I said, we should think about something like that. The governor went home, he thought about it, and he came back and he said, absolutely, let's do this. I'll come up with the money, because I don't think we want them to pay for this. I'll come up with the money in my budget, and together we got a consultant, and we evaluated the proposal, and the evaluation came back the day or two after the proponents withdrew their proposal because they realized that it wasn't going to work. And by the way, the evaluation we got from the consultants was it wasn't going to work. And the taxpayers would have been on the hook for a lot of money. And we said the taxpayers should not pay for this. And so it worked. So, and the final thing, we kind of like have this little saying, disagree without being disagreeable. And that's pretty much what's happened. And unlike what's happening in Washington, where they intentionally are going about the business of trying to hurt each other, that does not serve the public interest.
Do you have any explanation or thoughts as to why we frequently have a Republican governor but a Democratic House and Senate? Like bad candidates, Democratic?
So in the history of the Commonwealth, believe it or not, there's only been 3 periods when we've had a democratically controlled legislature. Twice in the 1800s, once for 2 years and once for 4 years, and then since about 1949, when the House went Democratic, Massachusetts House of Representatives, and then just a couple of years later, the Senate went Democratic, and it's been Democratic ever since. So most of us didn't know that that's the anomaly in the history of Massachusetts, is a Democratic legislature. And through most of the history, if you go back and you look at the number of Republican governors, it's been overwhelmingly Republican governors as opposed to Democratic governors. So I don't have any real theory, and I don't know that there's any facts to back anything up that anyone would say about it, but there seems to be a fair amount of support in Massachusetts for divided government, which is a legislature that's of one party and the governor of the other party. And it's worked reasonably well. And I have to tell you, because I've served with Democratic governors too, and the legislature works better mostly with the Republican governors than the Democratic governors, which has been a very interesting experience.
Governor Baker was a proponent for charter schools, and now that he has an ally in Betsy DeVos, is he still very strongly for charter schools?
He believes deeply in them, and I'm not going to be his spokesperson, but I know he still believes deeply in them. But he's not a foolish person. He saw that the voters, by roughly 63 or 4% of the votes, said no, we don't want any more charters to be added under the law. That doesn't mean there won't be more charters, because under the existing law, there was still room for another 11 charters, number one. And number two, 4 out of 5 charters survive, which means 1 out of 5 doesn't, which means those charters will become available when they go out of business to be given to someone else. So charters are not going away, it's just it's not going to grow dramatically. But if he could find a way, he would definitely push for more charters.
There's a bill in the state legislature that's an international issue, Israel-Palestine. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with it. Mm-hmm. This is a bill that punishes people with years in jail and hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines for supporting, not supporting boycotting Israel, but allowing people to believe that they want to support people who boycott Israel. And so I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts, and where is that bill going? Do you know?
Yeah. So
it's in 14, already passed by 14 states.
That's correct. And they're also debating this in Washington. So in the Massachusetts legislature, we tend not to take up bills that are more the purview of the national government, the federal government, than the state government. But as you point out, a bunch of other states have actually done this. I'm skeptical that the bill is actually going to move. If it does move, it won't be until next spring, and by then we're only 3 months away from the end of the formal sessions, which means a lot of other things would have to be pushed aside to take up that question. And since it's more about international affairs rather than local, I'm skeptical that the bill is going to get much traction.
about the funding and the, what is it, the oversight of,
Yeah.
on charter schools. I'm a retired teacher and in a small town, and it seems to me that the charter schools have the ability to suck money that should be in the town, and it upsets me. So what do you have a
Yeah,
suggestion?
in most states where they have charter schools, they're funded in a way that does not take money out of the traditional public schools. And in Massachusetts, they made a decision, and very few states have gone down this path, which is the money follows the child. And their argument is, you know, the kid's going to go to school, you're going to spend X if they're in the traditional public school, so what's fair is to let that X follow the child into the other school. That causes chaos, particularly in regions like this, where you have small schools and small school districts, and it bleeds both students and money. And when you bleed students and money, you're also taking the engaged parents away from the traditional public schools. So it was supposed to be an experiment. It was supposed to help create innovation. There were other mechanisms to do it. In fairness, we approved some mechanisms in the 80s, which the traditional public schools chose not to take up, which added fuel to the fire to do something different. But okay, what we ended up doing was not very smart. And I think that's what you saw on the ballot question, is that people said enough. You know, how many more of these do we need? And I had been fighting for years to create a separate line item. And of course, the charter schools don't want a separate line item because they think it then becomes a target during a recession. But you can easily fix that by limiting the reduction in that line item to the same amount as the traditional public schools. So you could have fixed that easily, but they were not willing to do it. And if they had done that, I believe they might have won the ability to get more charters.
So what are the chances of something like that changing?
I think you're going to see, I don't think you're going to see more charters beyond what the current law allows, and that's about 11 more in the whole state. And and as I say, some will turn over, and so those will be reused, but I don't see the growth. They overreached by asking for the number that they did on the ballot, and I don't see it coming back.
My question is about Wired West.
Yes.
I live in Heath, and a lot of the hill towns have been waiting for a number of years.
Yep.
Can you tell us what the progress is at this point?
So, to his credit, Governor Baker, it took 2 tries, but he finally got an approach, a formulation that is really beginning to work now by actually taking the money that the legislature set aside prior to his governorship, and he's handing it out as grants to the communities, whether they work alone or with other communities. There's not enough money in that pool. And remember, we got a bunch of money from the federal government. We've spent all of that. We put some state money up. We haven't spent all of it yet, but we will pretty soon have spent all of it. And I'm advocating that we put in another appropriation to be able to make sure that we can finish the job. So a lot of the communities are now actually out there making contracts, beginning to build their systems. So I can't speak community by community because I don't know, but overall, they're really starting to accelerate.
So are there any communities that implemented the high-speed internet?
Yes, there may be others in the room who could do a better job answering this, but I know, for example, Leverett did it, but they did it on their own, and they were given a grant because it wouldn't have been fair for them not to get some money when everybody else was getting some money. And there are a number of other communities that are moving along.
I wonder if there's a way through legislation that basic civics information could return to the public schools.
Absolutely. And Senator Harley Chandler of Worcester has been convening a working group of members from the House and the Senate and people outside, and they're working on a bill right now that she's hoping that she can have ready to put before the legislature this term. It used to be required in the statute, but then when ed reform came along in the early 90s, they took away all of the mandates of courses and created the frameworks and whatever. There's a couple of things they created, and that was the substitute. But they let that go, and that was a big mistake.
I have a question that might seem very narrow, but my understanding is that it affects a lot of people across the state. So I live in the Weldon House, and we recently had a battle over the heat being put on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, we're trying to work with Mr. Kulik and Paul Mark to get some legislation to change. Well, they're looking at the dates, and I was thinking what we really need, just to explain, they put the heat on on September 15th in the Weldon House because that's when they have to by law, except that it was 90 degrees outside for like the next 3 weeks. So they finally actually convinced the manager that she did have the power to shut the heat without switching back to air conditioning, and you can only have either air conditioning or heat. You can't offer both interchangeably. So is it possible, I'm listening to your process here, to get some kind of amendment to that? Does it need to be done by the legislature? Can the health department
It
do
should be done through regulation, and common sense would suggest.
Yes, you were very kind to me when I wrote to you in
Yeah.
May of whatever year that was, when they did it, and it got hot in May, and they couldn't put it on until June.
Right. That was a number of years ago.
Yeah,
and,
that was several
yeah.
years. So it's
So
a
it's the
problem.
same problem, and every so often the weather goes in such a way
Yeah.
that it becomes a big problem. And I always say that every law and every group of regulations should end with the final word is anything that conflicts with common sense shall prevail. We need to work with the agency to change the regulations. If they
Yeah.
won't do it, then we'll have to change the law.
And I was thinking what we really need is not a hard date, but some flexibility that reflects
Circumstantial.
temperature.
Yeah,
So if it's 90, you don't put on the heat,
right.
that would be
So
good.
we will work,
Yeah.
I'm glad Steve Kulik's on the case. I'll work with him and we'll try to figure out what we can do. It doesn't happen every year, but when it does, it really hurts people, because some people, it affects their health as well.
Has there been any movement in the direction of free tuition at public universities and colleges?
There's legislation pending, and there is a movement to do it. And if the fair share proposal, which will be on the November 2018 ballot, passes, and that's a change in the Massachusetts Constitution, which would say that on earnings above $1 million, you pay a 4% surtax. The first $1 million, you pay the same as everybody else. Everything above the $1 million, you pay a 4% surtax. That revenue would go into paying for two things: education and transportation. And if that passes, then it will free up money that we can invest in both expanded and different kind of educational programs as well as transportation. And this is a popular proposal. It's been done in a few states, and it's not terribly expensive. That said, we have to make choices and decide, is that the best way to spend the next dollar? Because after all, if you put more money into the budget, then tuitions and fees go down. And the question is, what's the best way to do this? Is it best to do it by saying the first 2 years are free, and is it at any public college or university? Or is it only if you go to a community college and then transfer, blah, blah, blah? So there are different models around the country, and we have to think this through. But there is momentum behind the idea.
State revenue collections have been disappointing for quite some time.
Yes.
And yet, if we're going to have a government Nobody is going to pay for it but us. Massachusetts has a use tax law, which says, essentially, if you buy something from another state, if you're bringing in goods from another state, the consumer has to pay a use tax, which is equal to the sales tax in most cases.
Mhm.
I've looked at the use tax, at the way it's collected, and there is a line in one of the schedules of the Massachusetts Form 1 where people report the amount of use tax they're going to pay. And there's also another way of paying it that requires a separate form. I don't think a lot of people are going to bother doing that. My experience when I was doing tax preparation was that nobody ever thought about such a thing. I wonder if there's any way that you're talking about to improve the collection of use taxes to make up for some of the shortfalls that are being caused by the reduction in sales tax revenue.
So that's a terrific analysis and a very deep question. Very few people would actually pay attention to that. So to your credit that you have. You're right, very, very, very few people do that. And the problem is even more compounded now with e-commerce, because people are buying things online, and under the federal law, you don't have to pay the sales tax. And we're trying to get the federal law changed. Governor Baker, to his credit, has creatively, and a couple of other governors have done the same thing, tried to argue that when you purchase online, your computer is basically located in the state, and therefore it is the vehicle through which you are purchasing, and therefore that should be the argument to require you to pay the sales tax. That's in court now. We'll see what happens. Nobody's framed it the way you have that I've heard, and that's something worth doing. It's basically on the honor system, and most people don't even think about or pay attention. You buy a refrigerator and ship down from New Hampshire in January, and you're not going to remember that in April. But thank you for raising that. I'll actually have to bring that back to the revenue people and ask them, take a look at that to see if anybody's actually doing any work on that.
Thank you. I'd like to raise a couple of questions about health care, if I may.
Yes, certainly.
What do you think about, and what are the prospects for the current bill for Massachusetts single-payer health plan? And what are the prospects now for Medicaid in Massachusetts? I think there's some problems coming out of it.
Yes.
And I have to, if I may ask, I've always thought you were badly needed in Washington, Stanley. Are you ever going to go there?
Well, okay, well, if elected, well, we'll start with the last one first, which is, I think I can do a lot more good in the current job that I'm in here in Massachusetts, especially because it's been 50 years since anybody from Western Mass has been in either the House or Senate the presiding officer. And so therefore, I think it would be a disservice to leave before I really had to leave. So if my health holds up, I'd like to try to be there for the whole 8 years. Now, John Olver and I used to have this conversation because he would say to me, so many of you know John, right? And so he would say, Stan, and he would say, Stan, I got to decide whether I'm going to run for re-election or not. And he said, I'm getting older and you're not getting any younger. And I said, John, don't even go there. We need you to stay there. You've earned seniority. You're on the Appropriations Committee. You're chair, and then later he was ranking member on 2 subcommittees of appropriations. And I said, it would be a disservice to Massachusetts and to Western Mass for you to leave before you have to leave. And all right. So you never know what the future will bring, but right now I have a wonderful position and I want to do the most with it that I can. So now on healthcare. So, God, healthcare, it consumes so much of our time and our money. So this is going to go on a little bit because I want to give you as complete a picture as I can. So right now, Medicaid consumes 42% of the state budget. And you may remember that in the early 90s, Massachusetts was a pioneer by deciding we were going to have all youngsters 18 years of age and younger had to have insurance. And that meant that if they were living in a household and their family didn't have insurance or have access to insurance coverage, that they were going to cover the parents as well. So that program was extremely successful and became the model for the National CHIPS program when the late Senator Kennedy took it to Washington and got it into law. Well, the next thing that happened was Massachusetts was encouraged by the federal government to begin to put working poor onto Medicaid. So these would be people who go to work every day but don't make enough money to buy their own insurance, and their employer doesn't provide insurance. And so tens of thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands of people were added to the Medicaid program. And then the federal government gave us a waiver to do this. And then when the waiver was about to expire and we went back to Washington, they said, we will not expand your waiver, sorry, we will not renew your waiver unless you also decide to be the first state in the country to have universal health insurance, because you are the state that's modeling how to run healthcare well and efficiently. And so we took up the challenge and we did that. And then, and that was in the early 2000s, and then in the later, maybe 8 or 10 years after that, we started working on cost containment, again at our own encouragement, but also the federal government was encouraging us because we had reached almost universal coverage, 98-point-something% of the people in Massachusetts. And so now they said, well, you're the best in the country in the number of people insured, so now we need you to show us what an innovative state can do to bring down the cost. So we then passed Chapter 224, set up a couple of new mechanisms to be able to collect the data, crunch the data, and then do the policy analysis and come up with strategies to spend the money smarter so that we could slow the rate of growth in healthcare costs. We're 4 years into that process, and it's showing some benefit and results, except it's mainly because we capped the growth, not because we've made so many changes yet. But we're getting closer. A year ago, I encouraged the Senate to embark upon a study program similar to what we did on marijuana. You may or may not know, but when I saw that I believed marijuana was going to be on the ballot in the last election, and so I told the Senate, I said, we should set up a study committee, send some people to Colorado and Washington, figure out how it's working, figure out what we're going to have to deal with, because I think it's going to be on the ballot, and I'm pretty sure it's going to pass. So we need to be prepared. We did that. We did such a good job on that with the help of the Milbank Fund in New York that we brought them a second project, and we have just completed the research, and within 2 weeks, we're going to release a piece of legislation. We visited 7 states to identify best practices in those states as recommended by the Milbank Fund to do cost containment strategies that are succeeding in those states that we're not yet doing. And so we will be releasing a plan, and you may also have read that the governor put forward some changes in Medicaid that the legislature said we can't take these up in the middle of the budget conference. There's been you didn't file a bill, been no hearings, no public discussion. You've only had private discussion with some of the stakeholder groups, and you haven't even discussed it with all the stakeholder groups. So we said, we promise we'll give you a fair hearing on it, but we're not going to do this now. So we are giving it the fair hearing, and we are actually going to recommend a few of the things he proposed, but not all of them, because his focus on cost containment is to reduce coverage and move people from better programs to programs that aren't as good. And that's how he's going to. We want to maintain quality, access, reasonable cost, and better outcomes. So the plan that you will see in a couple of weeks is going to be based on that. Now, single payer. One of the states we visited was Vermont. And we went to Vermont because they approved legislation to do single payer. And we wanted to find out what happened. And they brought all of the key players who worked to get single payer done. And they said basically that they had to abandon it after they put it into law because they could not figure out how to actually produce the savings that they believed, these were the people who proposed it, that they believed would come by doing single payer. And they said they could see some short-term savings, but within 5 years it would balloon out of sight, and they had no idea how to pay for it and to control the costs. So they, after signing it into law and trying to implement it, they actually pulled back. So we have a group that is studying the concept of a public option here in Massachusetts, and I think there may be something else that we'll see in the bill that is another step in considering trying to figure out some steps around that. One of my ideas has been to do a pharmacy program, a universal pharmacy access program for the entire Commonwealth. And everybody would have an insurance card and a pharmacy card. If everybody had that pharmacy card and they used that pharmacy card, that would be a single-payer pharmacy program. If that succeeded, then you could take that base, add some other things like preventive services, your annual physical, maybe mammograms and colonoscopies, so preventive medicine. But we're a long way from figuring out how to do this.
Could you explain why there is such a difference between on the revenue side when you do the budgets?
Yeah.
We always seem to overstate that.
You
the
mean our
revenue side.
projections
Yes.
versus our, yeah. So, very good. So when we do our budgeting, first we have to project how much revenue we're going to have. Then we have to ask the agencies, how much do you need in order to do the same thing next year that you did this year? And then if there's a difference, then we either have to cut, if there isn't enough money, or if there's extra money, then where would we put it? And you can put it into tax cuts, you can put it into additional services, where are you going to put the additional money? So in the 1980s, we were wildly overestimating revenues, and that's what led to the, quote, Massachusetts miracle collapsing. Remember when Governor Dukakis, as candidate presidential nominee, Dukakis came home and found a $700 million deficit. And so at that point, they went in and completely revised the system for how they were going to do revenues. And we set up a new system which had the House Ways and Means, Senate Ways and Means, Administration and Finance Secretary hold public hearings bringing in economists into a public setting and ask these, and it's usually 5 to 7 of them come in, what do you think the revenues are going to look like 18 months from now? Because we need to know in December so the governor can write his budget and give it to us in January so that we can approve a budget in July, and you're trying to figure out from that July until the July following how much revenue you think we're going to have. So you're projecting about 18 months ahead. It's a very hard thing to do. It's very, very hard. But we have, through that method, we have been pretty much for most of the period that was in place, we were underestimating the revenues we were going to collect. And that was intentional. So if let's say one group said, If the economist said 5% revenue growth and another one said 3, and the average was 4, we might do 3.5, so that we were building in a surplus, building in a cushion. And if that surplus materialized, we put it into the rainy day fund. So now we were building up the capacity, which we hadn't had prior to 1989, capacity to withstand recessions, in part based on having a rainy day fund, savings account. So it worked pretty well, but then something has happened in the economy in the last 10 years or so, and it's been particularly severe the last 2 years, 3 years actually, where the revenues, even though we're projecting them very conservatively, are still not hitting the mark. So there's a change in the international economy, a change in the national economy, and a change in the Massachusetts economy. And nobody can quite figure out or agree on what's causing it. What we know is we have the third highest per capita income in the country, and that's consistent. But the tax revenues coming in from the income tax are not meeting the projections. We have a robust, we have a reasonable sales tax, especially compared to our neighboring states, but it's not producing the revenues expected. 2 reasons we think. One is online sales, e-commerce, and the second is that people are making less, therefore less disposable income, therefore less purchase of goods and services that are taxed, and therefore less revenue. So we think that's at play. The capital gains is not keeping up. Capital gains were averaging 1.7 billion or so, and they've been coming in 1.2, 1.3. That $200-300 million gap is significant. And the corporate tax is not coming in at projected rates. The way I summarize it is, I think we have a 20th century tax system in a 21st century economy. And we need to figure out how to reorganize the tax system so that you end up with enough revenue to actually support the society that and the economy that we've built.
I have a follow-up.
Best I can do on that.
You said a 20th century tax system in a 21st century. Is it just the internet taxes that would,
It's a
or
big
is there
piece of
something
it. It's
more
worth 300 to 400 million, that alone. See, it's not one source. It's like 300 or 400 million here, 300 or 400 million there, 200 million there. Before you know it, you're talking real change. You know?
Getting back to the universal health and single payer, does that involve insurance companies?
Well, that's interesting, because single payer obviously means you're going to have only one payer, and it's usually a government program, although there are industrial societies that do use private insurance as well as public. In fact, many of them, if you have the money, you can go out and buy some private insurance on top of the public insurance that you get. But by definition, public systems, in almost all of the countries, it's a government-run program. But there would be nothing to prohibit the government from putting it out to bid and getting the best deal from one of the companies. That said, by definition, they should be making a profit because they're private. And then the question is, how do they make that profit? Are they collecting more than they need? Are they being more efficient? I'm told that the two most efficient healthcare programs in the country are Medicare and Medicaid. And if that's the case, those are government programs and running relatively efficiently.
I mean, anything like that has to be done with basically the tax. Everybody.
You have to collect the revenue. That is correct. It requires the tax.
It's a heck of a lot cheaper to be paying $200 to $300 a month for health insurance, for health care,
Yeah.
than paying $1,800 a month to a health insurance company.
So, but there's also a psychological barrier. There's also a psychological barrier you have to get over, because the state budget is just under 40 billion. Healthcare spending in Massachusetts, I think, is almost 60 billion. So that means when you create a single-payer health program of roughly $60 billion and you put it inside the government, you are more than doubling the entire state budget overnight, and the people have to have confidence that you can manage that $60 billion program. And a lot of people don't have that much faith. In principle, I think a lot of people really like this idea of single payer. The devil is in the details once you go to trying to figure out how to implement it and getting people's confidence. And that's why they were able to destroy Hillary Clinton's plan in Washington so many years ago, because, you know, you're not going to be able to pick your doctor and blah, blah, and blah, blah, and blah, blah. And it's very easy. You know, any damn fool can tear a house down. It takes a lot of skill to build a house. And so you put a proposal out, a bunch of crazy people can just knock the feathers out of it before you even start. But here's something really interesting, and I've said this to my staff, and I said, I don't know what this means yet, but let's be thinking about this. There are 1.9 million covered lives in the Mass Health Program, which is the state Medicaid program. If you add the Group Insurance Commission, which is public employees and retirees, and then you add the municipals as well, then you're well over 2 million people. I don't have the exact number in my head. It's probably close to 2.3, 2.4 million people. Blue Cross Blue Shield has almost 2 million covered lives. So that means you have in excess of 4 million of the 6.7 million people who live in the Commonwealth are in two insurance programs. So I don't know what to do with that yet. But when you have that many people in just those two programs, and Blue Cross, by the way, is not for profit. Now, some people think they still are too expensive, and they wonder, but it is a registered not-for-profit. But when you've got the government and one insurer covering in excess of 4 million of the 6.7 million lives in Massachusetts, you start to think about, well, what does that really mean? And where does that take us if we can get those two programs working together? And then how do we bring others in? Because I think in the end, you have to be incremental in this. Because taking $60 billion or $65 billion enterprise and throwing it into a $40 billion enterprise, especially since it's a public entity, it's not, you know, GE where everything can happen behind closed doors and the mistakes get covered up and blah, blah, and blah, blah. But there's something to this, and I just don't know what to do with it yet, but it just really strikes me that with that many people in just two places, I wonder if we could get them working together in some way, what that might produce for the Commonwealth.
As you know, one of the issues we have is the number of students that we're losing out of rural America, particularly in Massachusetts, this area, and other parts of the state. There's a group of superintendents who have been looking at that issue and trying to do something about our formula, and I'm wondering where that stands. Is that a bill, or is anything happening with that?
It's called Sparsity Aid, and in a few rural states, they have created a funding program for rural schools to add some additional funding that's based on scale. That is, it's small, therefore you have to provide more for that small district because there are fewer students over which to spread the fixed costs and the central costs, and so therefore you need some additional aid. So we did, when the Senate did the RISE Act 2 years ago, which was our response to the charter school issue, it was to change the dialogue and stop talking about just the 4% of the kids who are in charter schools and talk about all of the children in public education. And one of the elements we put in the bill was sparsity aid. Now, it was an early version, which when the local guys took a look at it, they didn't think it was going to work the way we designed it, which was fine, because we were just trying to put a marker down. So we're hoping that they will come back with a version that they think will work. But we also have to just remember that the scale problem is not going to go away, and therefore we have to keep encouraging schools to try to work together. We went through one exercise in Franklin County for a couple of years that led to shared purchasing, but that was as far as we could get. And there's a group of 4 communities in Franklin County now, and there's a group of communities in Berkshire County that are separately trying to figure out in their areas how to make small rural school districts viable, given the growth in costs and the reduction in the number of children. So a lot of work to be done there, but we're all over trying to help with the sparsity aid, but that's only a Band-Aid. It's not going to solve the problem in the long run.
Medicaid in Massachusetts equals Mass Health. They're synonymous, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that I learned as I became eligible for Medicare this year is that when you apply for Mass Health insurance, they look at your income. As I turned 65 and was eligible for Medicare, now they want to look at my income and my assets. So my question is, why isn't Mass Health always looking at what is your income and what are your assets?
I don't know. Let me figure this out. So Mass Health is Medicaid, and Medicaid is a federal state program, and that means that the state has to follow the federal rules except where we're given a waiver. So what I don't know, and I'll have to check, is whether it's under federal rule that you can only consider income. But I had a conversation very, very recently, in fact today, with someone who referenced the fact that Mass Health is looking at her assets. So,
and that was not my experience. And then as I
okay.
became eligible
So
for
I'll have
Medicare,
to-
I had that
I'll
conversation.
do some homework on that.
Might be a way to
Yeah,
save
so
some
that's
money.
interesting.
Question here
Oh.
about public transportation from a senior citizen. We used to live in Amherst, and the public transportation was wonderful. We moved to Leverett, and it's decreased to the point that apparently the 2 public transportation systems think that we belong to the other one, and we have no public transportation, and they blame the state. Are they right?
Well, we're always wrong. It's got to blame somebody. No, actually, I hadn't heard. So you're basically in a no man's zone, right? That they both think the other is doing it. I'll have to look into that. I've heard that situation in other places, but I didn't realize Leverett was part of that. But the reason Amherst transportation is so good is because it was built around the 5-college transportation system, which was paid for by the 5 colleges originally, and then eventually they joined PVTA, and now they're partners in this. And so there's a heavy subsidy coming from those institutions. They broadened out over time, but they don't go to a lot of places. But I can check that out a little bit.
Is minimum wage going up to $15? What will happen to small independent businesses that will be forced out?
Okay? Oh, this gives me the opportunity to tell you about my predecessor as Senate President 100 years ago. Mr. Coolidge of Northampton was Senate President 100 years ago. So when I was first sworn in, when I was first elected Senate President and made my comments and remarks on that very rostrum, literally 100 years prior, it was Calvin Coolidge making a similar speech. And interestingly, he was a Republican, and I am not. And he was conservative. I am not so much. And he was one of the guys who generated the minimum wage. People don't know that. He also was one of the people who led the fight to create the state income tax and the Equal Rights Amendment. How do you like that, huh? Not bad for a guy from Northampton who was a Republican 100 years ago. So the minimum wage, last one up 3 years ago, and they moved it to $12, I think it was, or $11. Yeah, $11, and it was $1 a year. And the last increase was last January. So advocates are now collecting signatures to put it on the ballot. And all of the polling shows that the public will support a minimum wage increase to $15 if the legislature does not take it up and put it on the governor's desk. So one way or another, I believe by the end of 2017, there will be, the approval will come for a $15 minimum wage. My preference is always to do legislation in the legislature because you can negotiate, nuance, you can make changes because the people who put something on the ballot come from a particular perspective. They have no obligation to consider any other stakeholder's point of view. There has been for a number of years complaints about the minimum wage. All of the research shows that to date, there is minimal disruption every time there's a change, and it's made easier when you can plan for it. So when there's no minimum wage increase for a few years, people's wages in relation to cost of living are actually going down, so their standard of living is dropping. And when you just do it all at once, it's a real shock to the business community. But if you do as we did last time and say we're going to do it over 3 years, and this is what you can expect, it works better. And all the research shows there is some dislocation, but it smooths out very quickly. The question is, at what point will you reach a tipping point where you'll start to actually have bigger negative effects? And so people are putting us on notice now that they really believe that the old discussion about minimum wage is different. I mean, the situation is different now, and don't think about it the way you did before, think about it the way you are, where it is now. Because although $15 an hour is not a livable wage in much of the Commonwealth, it is, according to some smart people, starting to reach a tipping point. So we may have to have some other policies that go along with it to really try to mitigate in some way. And so that conversation can happen in the legislature. It won't happen on the ballot because it's an up or down vote on the ballot, and once it passes on the ballot, it's very hard to change something that was approved on the ballot. So it's my hope that we will do it in the legislature and we'll have an adult conversation about this and really try to work it out. The biggest thing they're asking for on the business side is some form of a training wage, because young people coming in, a 17-year-old who comes in and is scooping ice cream is the example that I'm given all the time, making $15 an hour, you can only sell an ice cream cone for so much. And so that is starting to resonate with people, and so we have to think about that. But then what happens if it's a senior scooping ice cream? So is it about the age or is it the particular work? And so we have to think hard about this. But I do believe there will be an increase in the minimum wage within the next 2 years.
About the status of the regional bus issue for
Regional
instance,
school
Mohawk.
transportation? Regional school transportation? Yes. Yeah. Part of the problem is urban school districts and suburban school districts get no transportation aid. And there are many more legislators in suburban and urban, and so they say, not fair, which is why when I was Chair Ways and Means, I actually started an urban transportation line item, and it lasted about 3 years, and then that went away. So we'll keep fighting and trying to do the best we can, but it's really frustrating.
Did you want to make some closing comments or another question?
It's been really great spending some time with you, and I really appreciate it. And so many of you are familiar faces and people I've known for many years. So again, I want to thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your support. It really is an honor and a privilege to do this job. And I'll end where I started, which is I know that this is an opportunity you give me, and I'm a steward of the seat that I hold. and it's really your seat, and every 2 years when I have the opportunity to run for re-election, I ask for your support, and I appreciate how often you've allowed me to continue. Thank you.